What is the meaning of this disgrace?
I will not be silenced, father.
You will obey me!
My heart is his, not yours to command.
And mine is hers.
I saved a life tonight, Ilara said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Can you say the same? No one moved. 300 guests stood exactly as they were, crystal glasses suspended halfway to waiting lips, fans frozen mid-flutter, every eye fixed on the young woman standing in the doorway in a ruined gown. The musicians had not lowered their instruments so much as forgotten how to hold them. Lord Cassian Weld stared at her from across the marble floor. A moment before, he had placed the engagement ring on the table with the deliberate care of a man who wanted every person in the room to remember exactly what he had done. He had said, in a voice cold enough to silence even the wind outside, "Have you finished embarrassing us?" And he had expected tears. He had expected apologies, perhaps some dramatic collapse, certainly a public display of remorse sufficient to restore his dignity. He had not expected that. Ilara Fairholme did not look like a bride. The ivory silk gown that had left Vermont Manor 3 hours ago, the gown her mother had spent 6 weeks arranging, had been dragged through mud, and worse. The lace trim along the hem was torn clean through in 2 places. Her right shoe was missing entirely. Loose strands of golden hair framed a face marked by exhaustion and the particular calm that comes to a person who has made an irreversible decision and accepted it. She stepped into the light of the chandeliers. "There was an elderly woman beside the Millhaven Road," she said. Her voice remained level, which was somehow worse than if it had shaken. She had collapsed alone in the dust. Her fever was so high I could feel it before I touched her forehead. The doctor in the village said another hour would have killed her. She paused. I could not leave her. The whispers started at the back of the room and moved forward, like a tide. A beggar. She stopped for a beggar. She kept the heir to the Weld fortune, waiting for a woman selling flowers. Imagine, 3 hours. For a stranger. Has she lost her mind entirely? Ilara heard all of it. She turned her head slightly and looked at the assembled nobility of the kingdom, the men and women who had attended her family's celebrations since she was a child, who had praised her embroidery and admired her posture, and told her mother what a credit to the Fairholme name she was. Not one of them met her eyes. She turned back to Cassian. I'm sorry I frightened you. I'm not sorry I stayed. Cassian's jaw shifted. Something moved behind his eyes. Not regret, not concern, but calculation. The mental arithmetic of a man weighing reputation against the satisfaction of winning an argument. His hand moved to his lapel and stayed there. It was Duke Aldrich Fairholme who stepped forward. He descended the 3 marble steps from the reception platform slowly, deliberately, the way a man descends stairs when he wants every person in the room to remember that he is the one descending them. He was not a tall man, but he had a quality of mass, of density, that made him seem larger than his actual height. His evening coat was perfectly pressed. His expression was composed. He stopped 3 feet from his daughter. You have kept every noble family in this kingdom waiting for 3 hours and 7 minutes, he said. You stand before us in this condition, and you offer us a dying woman beside the road as your explanation. She was dying, Ilara said quietly. That is not an explanation. It is a fact. Blanche. Her mother's voice came from the side of the room, barely above a whisper. Duchess Marion Fairholme stood with both hands pressed against the engagement table, as though she needed it to remain upright. Her face was the color of old paper. Ilara looked at her mother. For one moment, something broke open between them, recognition, sorrow, the specific grief of two people who love each other and cannot reach each other across the distance that has just opened up. Then Aldrich reached for Ilara's left hand. She looked down in confusion. She hadn't expected that. She had expected more words, another accusation, perhaps a formal order to leave the room and compose herself. She had not expected his fingers to close around hers with the practiced certainty of a man who has made up his mind. The signet ring of the Fairholme family had belonged to the daughters of their line for 6 generations. It was a plain gold band set with a single dark garnet, modest by noble standards, but heavy in the way that ancient things are heavy, weighted with everything that came before. Ilara had worn it since her 16th birthday. She had not taken it off once in 7 years. Aldrich removed it from her finger. The room was so quiet that the sound of his boots on the marble as he stepped back was audible. "From this moment forward," he said, "you carry neither the Fairholme name nor the Fairholme protection." Ilara felt the floor shift beneath her as though something structural had failed. She looked at her mother. Marian was already moving, crossing the floor with small, careful steps, her hands shaking visibly. Around Ilara's neck hung a sapphire pendant, a thin chain supporting a deep blue stone that had passed from mother to daughter in the Fairholme family for 3 generations. Marian's fingers found the clasp at the back of Ilara's neck. They fumbled. She tried again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly that only Ilara could possibly have heard it. "I'm so sorry, my love." The chain came free. Ilara did not move. She held very still and let it happen. Cassian approached last. He was composed in a way that Ilara now recognized as practiced rather than genuine, the performance of a man who had decided how he wished to appear before an audience, and was executing that performance with precision. He extended his open palm. Ilara looked at the engagement ring on her finger. She remembered the morning 3 months ago when Cassian had placed it there, in the garden at Vermont Manor, while gardeners worked at a respectful distance, and her father watched from the terrace with visible satisfaction. She had thought, at that moment, that she was beginning something. She understood now she had been mistaken about what. She removed the ring and placed it into Cassian's palm. He slipped it into his breast pocket. Then, very quietly, he said, "Perhaps you truly belong among the people you chose." Those words reached somewhere the others had not. Ilara turned and walked toward the doors. No one called her name. No one moved to follow. 300 people watched her leave, and no one said a word, including the men and women who had admired her kindness in private conversation for years, who had told her mother what a rare quality it was, who had accepted her family's hospitality and eaten at her family's table, and stood now in their evening clothes and did not move. In the entrance hall, a figure stepped out from the corridor to the left. Alfred Brennan had been the head steward of Vermont Manor for 31 years. He had taught Ilara to pour tea without spilling when she was 5 years old. He had attended her first formal dinner and quietly repositioned her fork twice without anyone noticing. Every Christmas, a small wrapped parcel had appeared outside his room, and every Christmas he had pretended to be surprised. His eyes were red. He was not pretending anything. He pressed a small leather purse into her hands without speaking. Ilara looked at it, then at him. "There is enough there for several weeks," he said. His voice held with some effort. "And my sister in Millhaven keeps a room she doesn't use. Her name is—" He stopped, straightened. "A house may close its doors. Heaven never closes its heart." Ilara held the purse tightly and embraced him. He patted her back once, very carefully. the way a person touches something they are afraid to break. Then she walked out through the great entrance doors of Vermont Manor and into the dark. The night air was cold and smelled of rain that had passed an hour ago. Gravel crunched under her one remaining shoe. The torches along the front drive illuminated the carriages of guests still arriving, coachmen craning to see what had happened. A footman frozen with his arm raised to open a door. Elara kept walking. She had no destination yet. She had the purse, the torn gown, one shoe, and the particular clarity that comes when everything you believed permanent has been removed in a single evening. Behind her, through the tall windows of the ballroom, the chandeliers still blazed. The musicians, she supposed, would eventually begin playing again. Her mother would find somewhere to sit. Her father would resume accepting congratulations from men who would later tell each other privately they had always found Elara somewhat reckless. She turned left at the end of the drive toward the Millhaven Road and did not look back. The Fairvane estate disappeared behind a curve in the road. The torches were still visible for a moment, orange points of light between the trees. And then those too were gone, and Elara walked in the kind of darkness that exists between places, between the life she had known and whatever came next. She had made the journey to Millhaven twice before by carriage. She knew the road turned north past the mill and then followed the stream for half a mile before the village came into view. On foot, in the dark, with one shoe, it would take 2 hours at least. Her feet found the rhythm of it without her permission, the steady forward movement that the body makes when the mind has run out of things to decide. She thought, in a strange, removed way, about the woman on the road. Wren, the doctor had called her. A small woman with white hair and a basket of wildflowers lying in the dust of the Millhaven Road as carriages rolled past. Elara had counted 3 separate coaches pass without stopping. The occupants had looked. One richly dressed woman had frowned and said something to her companion. Then they had all continued on their way. Elara had stepped down from her own carriage before she fully decided to. Her coachman had protested, gently at first and then with more urgency, listing the names and faces waiting at Vermont Manor in ascending order of importance. She had heard him. She had wrapped her cloak around the old woman anyway. She was not certain she could have done otherwise. Some choices did not feel like choices at the moment they were made. They felt like the only thing a person with 2 functioning arms and a carriage could possibly do when a woman was burning with fever in the dust of an empty road. She did not regret it. She was certain she would need to hold on to that fact in the coming days, when regret would arrive in the form of hunger or cold, or the specific loneliness of a person who has lost the map they were using to navigate their own life. She filed it away carefully, the way a person files away a candle against a long night. I do not regret it. The stream came into view on her right, silver in the moonlight, moving quietly over stones. And then, at the bend where the road curved toward the village, a small light appeared, a lantern held by a figure standing very still beside a cart. Elara slowed. The figure moved into the road, and the lantern light caught a face she recognized. White hair, dark eyes, the particular expression of a person who has been expecting you. "You walked," said Wren. "You're out of bed," Elara replied. The old woman made a sound that might have been a laugh. She was upright and moving, which was more than Elara had dared hope for 3 hours ago. The fever had broken, the doctor had said. Rest and warmth and time. "Come home with me," Wren said. "Not come to my house. Home." Elara looked at the lantern, at the dark road behind her, at the old woman's steady face. Then she stepped forward, and together they walked toward the village, and the lantern made a small warm circle around them. And beyond its edge, the night was very large and very quiet, and entirely indifferent to what had just been lost. The house that Ilara's uncle kept on the eastern edge of the city was 3 stories of pale stone set behind an iron gate, modest by noble standards, but respectable enough to matter. She had spent summers there as a child. She knew the sound the third step made, the particular smell of the hallway in winter, the way the light moved through the parlor windows in the late afternoon. She knocked on the door just before midnight. Her aunt opened it, saw her, pulled her inside with one fast movement, checked the street in both directions, and closed the door. "Does anyone know you came here?" her aunt said. "Not hello, not are you hurt, not what happened to your face." "I don't believe so," Ilara said. Her aunt's shoulders dropped with visible relief. The parlor was warm. Someone had kept a fire going, which meant they had been awake and waiting, which meant word had traveled faster than Ilara's 2-hour walk. Her uncle sat in the chair by the window. He rose when she entered, and she saw from his expression that he had already decided what he was going to say, and that he had practiced it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He clasped his hands in front of him. He was a careful man, her uncle, careful with money, and careful with words, and careful with anything that might damage the position he had spent 30 years constructing in the second tier of noble society. Always close enough to the first tier to benefit from its warmth, never close enough to be held responsible for its failures. "You understand," he said, "that what happened tonight will be in every newspaper in the kingdom by morning." "I expect so," Ilara said. "And you understand that your father's decision, whatever we may privately think of it, was made publicly, before witnesses, and cannot be undone without making him appear weak." "I understand that he believes that." Her uncle's eyes tightened slightly. "Ilara, I am trying to help you." "I know." "Then listen carefully. You cannot stay here. Not tonight. Not while the story is still fresh." He paused. "My position at the ministry depends on relationships that depend on reputation. If the Duke of Fairvane looks toward this house and sees his disgraced daughter inside it, everything I have built—" The door from the inner hallway opened, and her cousin Edmund entered, still in his evening clothes from wherever he had been. He was 3 years older than Ilara, and had spent those 3 years at the Academy of Noble Arts, which had given him a fine education in self-interest. He looked at her. Then he crossed the room and knelt down in front of her chair. "Ilara," he said quietly, "I need you to listen to me." She looked at him. He had been her closest friend for the first 12 years of her life. They had shared books and escaped tutors, and invented complicated games in the East Garden during the long summer afternoons of their childhood. "I have my final examinations in 4 months," he said. "If I pass, I receive my commission. If my commission is revoked because the family name is associated with a scandal—" He stopped. His eyes were genuinely distressed. "I'm not asking you to disappear forever. I'm asking you to wait until after the spring term. Stay somewhere quiet, somewhere no one will connect you to us. 4 months, Ilara. I'll find a way to help you after that. I swear it." She looked at his face for a long moment. The distress was real. The love, she thought, was also probably real, in the way that love can be real and still lose to other things when tested. "After 4 months, she said quietly, "will you tell anyone what happened here tonight? Will you say that I came to this house and that you turned me away?" Edmund's jaw worked. "I didn't turn you away. I'm asking you to wait." "Will you tell anyone?" she repeated. He looked at the floor. Her aunt placed a hand briefly on Ilara's shoulder. "We'll give you money," she said. "Enough to find somewhere decent. There's a respectable boarding house in the North Quarter that doesn't ask questions. You could stay there while you work out what to do next. It's not abandonment, Ilara. It's practicality." "I know what it is," Ilara said. She stood up. Her uncle moved as though he might say something else, something that would make this feel more like care, and less like what it was. He stopped himself. Perhaps he knew it would not land the way he intended. Perhaps he was simply tired. Ilara went to the door. "Take the money, at least," her aunt said behind her. She took the money. Not because she wasn't angry, but because she was not foolish enough to refuse it. Outside, the air was colder than before. She stood on the step and pulled her ruined gown tighter against her shoulders and looked at the iron gate and the empty street beyond it. The city was quiet at this hour, that particular quiet that belongs to the space between midnight and dawn, when even the restless are finally still. She did not go to the boarding house. She walked. She did not have a clear destination. She had the purse from Alfred, and the money from her aunt, and the clothes on her back, and the specific kind of emptiness that fills the space where certainty used to be. The Millhaven Road was 2 miles from here. She had walked it once already tonight, and her feet were telling her clearly what they thought about that. She kept walking anyway. Somewhere around the 2nd mile, with the city behind her and the countryside opening up on either side of the road, she stopped. She sat down on the low stone wall that ran along the edge of a field and put the purse in her lap and looked at the sky. It was very large. The stars did what stars do when you are sitting alone in the middle of the night with nothing left to protect. They became visible in the way they never quite are from inside a lighted room. No one had asked if she had eaten. The thought arrived quietly and stayed. 3 hours inside her uncle's house, and not one person had thought to ask whether she had eaten since morning. She had been so focused on following the conversation that she hadn't noticed the hunger until just now, sitting on a stone wall in the dark, and now she was aware of it with the sudden intensity of something that had been waiting patiently for her to be still. She had saved a life today. A woman was breathing in a village somewhere to the north because Ilara had stopped beside the road and decided that being on time was not the most important thing. The doctor had said another hour would have been too late. Ilara had been there. She had stayed. And she had spent the hours since then standing in rooms where no one asked if she was hurt, if she was frightened, if she had eaten, where she would sleep. She picked up a handful of small stones from the road and dropped them one by one, not with anger, just to have something to do with her hands while she sat with what she was feeling. The stones made small sounds in the dark. The field smelled of grass and the particular mineral coldness of the night. After a while, she stood up and continued walking toward Millhaven. She arrived as the sky began to lighten, that narrow window of blue-gray before sunrise when the world looks like it is deciding whether to begin. The village was asleep. The stream moved in its quiet way along the eastern edge. The church sat solid and dark at the center of the square. And at the end of the lane that curved south from the square, a light was burning in a low window. Ilara stood before it for a moment. Then she knocked. Wren opened the door before the sound had fully faded, as though she had been standing just inside waiting for exactly this knock. "I didn't know where else to go," Ilara said. The old woman stepped back from the door. "Then you're home," she said. The stove defeated her 4 times before breakfast. The first attempt produced a great deal of smoke and no fire. The second attempt produced a small fire that went out immediately, as though offended. The third attempt involved a piece of flint that slipped and skinned Ilara's knuckle. The fourth attempt, the one that finally caught, sent a puff of ash directly into her face. She stood in Wren's small kitchen, covered in soot, one eye watering, and heard the old woman begin to laugh from her chair by the window. It was a real laugh, not polite amusement, but the kind that bends a person forward and refuses to stop. Ilara caught her reflection in the curved side of the copper kettle. The soot had settled in a neat smear across her nose and her right cheek, and her hair, which had already been considerably damaged by the previous night, now contained what appeared to be a small piece of kindling. She started laughing too. It was, she would think later, the first honest thing that had happened to her in the past 12 hours. The cottage had 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft that Ilara reached by a set of steps, so steep they were practically a ladder. The roof was sound but low. The walls were stone, thick enough to hold the warmth of the fire, and cold enough at the corners to remind you that the winter had opinions. The garden outside was small and extremely opinionated, with runner beans that had gotten entirely out of hand, and an apple tree that produced fruit in absolute abundance, and left it all on the ground as a philosophical statement about generosity. Wren moved through this space with the particular efficiency of someone who has arranged their life around what actually matters. Nothing was wasted. The bread was made on Tuesdays and Fridays. The soup pot on the stove was refilled each evening with whatever vegetables the day had provided. The single extravagance in the kitchen was a small tin of good tea, kept on the highest shelf and brought down each evening after supper. The first morning, Ilara tried to help with everything and was gently redirected. She tried to chop the vegetables and produced pieces of such varied size that Wren held up a slice the width of her thumb and another the size of a fingernail, and said simply, "Again." She tried to knead bread and covered herself and a substantial portion of the ceiling with flour. She tried to carry water from the well and discovered that the bucket was much heavier full than it appeared empty. "How do you do all of this alone?" she asked, setting the bucket down and shaking out her arms. Wren took the bucket and carried it inside without apparent effort. "I've been doing it for 40 years. "That's not an answer." "It is." "You just expected a different one." The village was called Millhaven, and it had perhaps 60 families, a church, a mill, a doctor's house, a blacksmith, and the kind of collective memory that small communities develop over generations of close proximity and mutual dependence. They knew things about each other without needing to be told. They knew whose well was going dry, and whose cow was producing less than expected, and whose eldest son had written home, and whose hadn't. They knew Wren had taken in a girl from the city, and they were watching, not with hostility, but with the patience of people who have learned that most things resolve themselves if you give them enough time. The first time Ilara walked through the village square, a group of children stopped and stared. One small girl pointed. "Your dress is very dirty," she announced. "Yes," Ilara said. "Did you fall in a river?" "Something like that." The girl considered this. "My brother fell in the river once, and Mama made him sleep in the barn." "That seems fair," Ilara said. The girl laughed and ran back to her friends, and that was, apparently, sufficient introduction. The next morning, 3 children were waiting outside Wren's gate with their slates, because someone had told them the new woman could read, and in Millhaven, people who could read were expected to share the skill. Ilara sat down under the oak tree in the front yard and began. She had not expected to find purpose here. She had expected to be surviving, which was a different activity entirely. But the children came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the end of the first week there were 7 of them, and by the end of the second week 11, crowded under the oak tree in the early mornings before the day's work began. learning to sound out words they had never seen written down, celebrating each success with the pure, transparent joy that children produce when no one has yet taught them to be embarrassed by learning. Elara celebrated with them. Each small success felt enormous to her in a way she couldn't explain. Perhaps because her previous life had involved succeeding at things that were already expected of her. And this was different. This was watching a child discover that the marks on a page meant something and were meant for her, too. Afternoons belonged to Wren's rounds. The old woman made her way through the village each day with baskets of soup and bread and whatever else the day had produced in excess, visiting the households that were struggling in ways that didn't always announce themselves. The widow with the weak knees who couldn't manage the stairs well. The old man who had been ill all winter and lived alone. The young family whose twins were eating faster than their mother could keep up. Elara went with her, at first as company, then as help, then because she had started to know these people herself, to know their names and the particular details of their situations and the things they needed that were not in any basket. Mrs. Ellis, the widow, had lived alone for 2 years and was hungry not just for soup, but for someone to sit with her for 20 minutes. Old Mr. Cooper wanted his dignity respected more than any particular kind of food. The twins' mother was exhausted beyond what food could fix, but the exhaustion was manageable when someone else picked up the twins for an hour. One evening, Wren divided a loaf between several baskets when there were only 2 of them at the table. "There'll be nothing left for us," Elara said. Wren finished the division without pausing. "We've never gone hungry after feeding someone else." This proved true in ways that Elara couldn't fully account for. The blacksmith left a sack of flour outside the gate one morning. The family with the mill sent grain. Mrs. Ellis sent back preserved fruit in small jars. Things circulated. Nothing disappeared entirely. The village operated on a logic that was different from the one Elara had been raised in, where resources were accumulated and protected, and what you had was yours. And the logic here was something else, something older and more practical. She thought about this during the evening tea, which had become the fixed point of her days. Each evening after supper, Wren brewed the good tea from the high shelf, and they sat outside in the 2 wooden chairs under the oak tree, and the village settled into its evening rhythms around them, the sounds of children being called inside, a dog somewhere making its opinion known, the mill wheels slowing as the workday ended. These were the conversations that changed her. Not the dramatic ones, not the moments of crisis or revelation, but the quiet ones. Wren's voice in the near dark, offering things she had gathered over a long life, with the same deliberate economy she applied to dividing bread. Why do people with so little always give so much? Elara asked one evening. Wren was quiet for a moment. Because they remember what it feels like to have nothing. Elara turned this over. At the manor, we gave to charity. We made donations. There were events. That's different. How? Giving from abundance is arithmetic, Wren said. Giving from scarcity is faith. Another evening, do you think my father made the right decision? Wren didn't answer immediately. The darkness had the patience of something that has been there long before either of them, and expects to be there long after. I think your father made the decision that protected what he was most afraid of losing. His reputation. His sense of himself. Wren stirred her tea. It's more fragile than reputation. Reputation can be rebuilt. The story a man tells himself about who he is, that's harder. Does it ever change? The old woman looked at her. That's not a question I can answer. It's a question only he can. It was on a Tuesday morning, a month after she arrived, that Elara first saw Edmund. She had no reason to pay special attention to a man in traveling clothes helping push a farmer's cart out of the mud on the Millhaven Road. People passed through the village. Some stopped. Most didn't. She noticed him only because he did not accept the farmer's thanks with the slightly pained courtesy of a well-bred person performing charity. He accepted it the way people accept warmth from a fire, naturally, as though being thanked for helping was simply a part of the transaction. He helped with the bridge that week. The old wooden bridge over the stream had been weakening for 2 seasons, and the village had finally organized a repair effort, which meant everyone who could lift something came out on Tuesday morning with whatever they could carry. Edmund carried timber. He greeted people whose names he didn't know yet with the ease of someone who assumes he will know them soon. He helped elderly men position stones. When the village children needed shorter pieces of wood, he knelt beside them and showed them how to measure safely, making the kind of small, unnecessary explanation that benefits the child more than the task. Within an hour, the village had decided he was all right. Then Wren's goose, a large and emphatically opinionated white creature that had terrorized the southeast corner of the village for 3 years, spotted him. The goose lowered its head. Edmund looked at it with the expression of a man who has faced many things in his life, but had not specifically prepared for this one. "Is that bird?" the goose charged. The children abandoned the bridge work entirely. Edmund dropped the piece of timber he was carrying and ran, which turned out to be exactly the wrong decision, as it confirmed the goose's assessment that he was worth pursuing. 3 circuits of the village square. Later he climbed onto an empty cart and declared himself a prisoner of war. "I surrender," he announced. "The bridge is yours." The goose considered this, then turned and walked away with extraordinary dignity. Elara was laughing harder than she had laughed since she was a child. Edmund looked at her from the top of the cart with the expression of a man who has decided to find his own humiliation funny, which she was learning was a quality of some importance in a person's character. "I hope," he said, "that this is not how the village tests everyone who arrives." "Only the ones who look too confident," she said. He climbed down. "I'm Edmund. Elara." "Nice to meet you, Elara." They carried timber together for the rest of the morning. He asked questions that were good questions, not the kind designed to demonstrate his own knowledge, but the kind that actually wanted answers. He listened when she answered. He remembered what she said. When she mentioned that the widow on the eastern lane preferred apple tea, he stopped at the widow's gate on his way back through the village and asked the children if anyone knew where apple tea came from locally. The small courtesies, the ones that cost nothing and are given freely and mean, in total, more than anything expensive. Wren watched him from the door of the cottage. When Elara came inside that evening, the old woman was sitting at the kitchen table with a particular expression, the settled look of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. "He comes back," she said. Elara set down her basket. "He seems to be passing through." "People who are passing through don't fix the widow's fence." Elara had not noticed the fence. She looked out the window. The fence was repaired. Wren was already pouring the tea. Edmund came back. He appeared without announcement, which was already his way, there one morning when Elara arrived at the oak tree and found half her students already surrounding him, demanding to know where he had been. He greeted each child by name. He remembered what they had told him on his last visit, whose dog had puppies, whose sister was learning to walk, whose father had recovered from his winter cough. He brought 3 small books, which he placed on the grass without ceremony. Elara picked one up. It was a collection of stories for children, the kind that had been read to the point of softness, the covers worn to velvet. She looked at the handwriting on the inside cover, a name she couldn't quite make out, and something about the ink, old and dark, told her the book was much older than it appeared. "Where did these come from?" she asked. "A library," Edmund said. "One that won't miss them." She looked at him for a moment. He was watching the children, and his expression was the one she had learned over the past weeks to associate with moments when he was telling her something that was not, technically, untrue. She let it go. They spent the morning reading, taking turns with the children, laughing when a difficult word became a long collective project of syllable-by-syllable negotiation. Then, in the afternoon, the village discovered that its harvest festival had arrived, and that several someones working together, had entered Ilara and Edmund's names into nearly every competition on the list. Wren was found in the square with an expression of complete innocence. They failed the three-legged race in spectacular fashion, falling into the hay bale that was meant to mark the finish line approximately 4 steps after the start. During the pie contest, Edmund added salt instead of sugar in a quantity sufficient to cure a winter's worth of meat. Ilara's archery sent an arrow into the wooden fence surrounding the contest area, which the village carpenter said was honestly the most efficient way to give him work. So perhaps she had won something after all. None of it mattered. What mattered was that Edmund laughed. He laughed at himself and at the goose, which had appeared again and taken a formal position of opposition to his continued presence in the village, and at the children who were keeping score of his failures with great precision and visible delight. When evening came and the lanterns were lit and the music slowed, Edmund stood beside her. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. "I should warn you, I'm not very graceful." "I've seen the archery," he said. "That bad?" "Worse." They danced anyway, and neither of them was graceful, and the children watched from the edge of the square and whispered to each other the way children do when they have noticed something adults are pretending not to. Later, when the celebration was winding down, Wren stopped Edmund near the door of the cottage. Ilara was inside washing the teacups and could hear the low murmur of voices without making out the words. When Edmund came in to say goodnight, something in his expression had shifted. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be away for a while," he said. Ilara set down the teacup she was drying. "How long?" "I don't know yet." She nodded. She had learned from Wren that trust was not built by demanding answers. It was built by giving people time to come back with them. "Travel safely," she said. He hesitated. Then he nodded and left, and the sound of his boots on the path faded into the usual sounds of the village settling into night. He was gone for 2 weeks. Ilara did not speak his name. She continued the lessons under the oak tree and the afternoon rounds with Wren's baskets and the evening tea. She looked toward the Millhaven Road each evening and was honest enough with herself to admit what she was doing, even while she continued doing it. On the 15th morning, she was helping 3 children work through a particularly stubborn passage in one of the books Edmund had left, when the sound of horses reached the square. Not one horse. Several, moving fast and in formation. The children looked up. Ilara looked up. 6 riders entered the village square, wearing the royal colors of the kingdom, silver and deep blue, the crest on their breastplates, the unmistakable mark of the palace guard. The captain dismounted and looked around the square with the directed attention of a man who knows what he is looking for. His eyes found Edmund. Edmund had come from around the side of Wren's cottage, drawn by the sound as everyone else had been. He was carrying a length of timber he had been preparing for a fence repair. He stopped. The captain walked to him directly. He did not slow. He dropped to one knee. Behind him, every rider dismounted and dropped simultaneously. and the sound of metal and leather hitting the ground in perfect unison was extraordinary in the quiet of the village square. "Your Royal Highness," the captain said, "His Majesty requests your immediate return to the palace." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people realize simultaneously that they have been understanding something incorrectly. Edmund closed his eyes briefly, opened them. He was looking at Alara. She looked back at him. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. She had enough information now to know that he meant them completely. She also had enough information to know that they were not sufficient. She crossed the square to him. The captain remained on his knee. The other guards did not move. Several village children had pressed close together, and one small boy was tugging on Alara's sleeve, trying to confirm that the man who had lost a running race to a goose was actually the future king of the kingdom. "How long have you known?" she said to Edmund. Her voice was very level. She had learned this from Wren. The things that matter most are usually said quietly. "I have known who I am since I was born," he said. "That isn't what I asked." He held her gaze. "Since the first week, when you were teaching the children under the oak tree, and you celebrated for a full minute because a 6-year-old sounded out her first 2-syllable word." She absorbed this. "And you decided not to tell me." "I wanted you to know me," he said, "before you knew the title." He paused. "I needed to know if the person I was becoming out here was worth knowing, and I needed someone who would tell me honestly." He stopped. "You've been telling me honestly since the first morning." She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she wanted to say, and she was choosing between them with some care, because she had learned in the past months that the first version of a feeling is not always the most accurate one. "You should have told me," she said, "not because it would have changed anything, but because I deserved to know." "Yes," he said, simply, directly, without defense. "I'll need time to think about that." "I know." The captain was still on one knee. Alara glanced at him and then back at Edmund. "You should go." "I'll come back." "I know," she said, and meant it. She stood in the square and watched the royal guard ride out of Millhaven with Edmund at their center, his traveling clothes among the silver and blue like a deliberate reminder of what he had chosen to be for a year in a village where no one asked his name. She stood there for a while after the last rider disappeared. Then Wren appeared at her elbow. "You knew," Alara said, not a question, "since the day he arrived." Alara looked at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" Wren was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had something in it that Alara could not quite name, something old and settled and very sure of itself. "Because some things need to grow in their own time." Then, from the same pocket where she usually kept her scissors and her small cloth for wiping the garden tools, Wren produced a sealed letter. The seal was one Alara recognized. She had seen it on official correspondence at Valmont Manor her entire childhood. The royal crest. "The captain left this for you," Wren said. Alara broke the seal. Inside, in handwriting she did not recognize, was a summons. Not a request, not an invitation. A summons bearing the king's name, commanding her presence at the royal court, along with Duke Aldrich Fairvane, Lord Cassian Weld, and the households and guests who had witnessed the dissolution of the Fairvane engagement. Attendance, it noted at the bottom, is not optional. Alara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully. "I'll need to find something to wear," she said. Wren smiled and went inside. The corridor outside the royal court's main chamber was long and cold, and lit by torches that burned with the steady indifference of things that have no opinion about what passes beneath them. Ilara arrived early, escorted by 2 palace guards who had met her carriage with a courtesy that she suspected was deliberate, a signal of the king's intention before the formal proceedings began. She had not expected to see Cassian in the corridor. He was standing near the window at the far end, alone, dressed in his finest coat, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the journey here constructing an argument, and was now feeling less confident about it than he had been when he started. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he walked toward her. "Ilara," he said. "Lord Cassian," she replied. Something moved across his face at the formal address. He stopped a few feet away. He was a tall man, and he had always known how to use his height in a room, how to arrange himself to advantage, but he seemed smaller here somehow. Or perhaps she was simply seeing him from a different angle than she had before. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way a man says something he has decided must be said, not the way a man says something he can no longer keep from saying. There was a difference, and she had learned to hear it. "I know," she said. He blinked. He had expected something else. Denial, perhaps, or the graciousness of someone who would make the conversation easier for him by pretending the difference didn't matter. "I treated you—" He stopped, started again. "What I said to you that night was unjust. I have thought about it many times since." "I believe you," Ilara said. "I also believe you are thinking about it more now than you were 6 months ago." She said this without particular cruelty, simply as information. "What changed?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Lady Seraphine Ashcroft." She had heard about this. The kingdom had heard about it. The dissolution of that engagement at a royal banquet. Lady Seraphine's ring placed on the table with a composure that suggested she had been planning the gesture since before the soup course, Cassian's public humiliation thorough enough to reach even Millhaven. "She reminded you how it felt," Ilara said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes." She looked at him, this man she had known for 2 years, this man whose proposal she had accepted because he was charming and admired, and because her father had wanted her to, and because she had not yet learned the difference between a person who is kind and a person who performs kindness for an audience. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "I decided to do it quite early, actually, because I found out very quickly that anger is expensive to maintain, and I had other things I needed my attention for." Hope moved across his face. She watched it carefully. "But that is not the same," she continued, "as us belonging together. Those are 2 separate, and I think you may have confused them." She paused. "Forgiving someone means you don't carry the weight of what they did to you. It doesn't mean you walk back into the life they put you in." He lowered his head. There was nothing more to be said, and they both knew it. After a moment, Ilara turned and walked toward the doors of the court chamber, and Cassian remained at the window, and the torches burned with their steady, indifferent light. Inside the chamber, the assembled nobility of the kingdom was a remarkable and somewhat chastened spectacle. Dukes stood beside earls, beside lords, every one of them dressed with the careful attention of people who know they are being observed and are uncertain what observation will reveal. Whispers moved through the room, but quietly, the kind of whispers that are checking their own temperature rather than spreading heat. Duke Aldrich stood at the front with his head lowered. Beside him, Duchess Marion held her hands together with the controlled stillness of someone fighting very hard not to look at the door. Ilara came through it. Marion's hands closed tighter. Aldrich did not look up. Then the great doors at the other end of the chamber opened, and the herald announced King Henry, and everyone bowed, and the king entered with Edmund at his right hand, and Wren, in her plain village dress with her basket over one arm at his left. Several people looked at the basket. A duchess in the fourth row appeared to be revising her understanding of how the mourning was going to proceed. The king walked the length of the chamber. He passed the dukes, the earls, the assembled representatives of every noble house in the kingdom. He stopped in front of Rennes. Then, before the entire court, King Henry of the kingdom lowered himself onto one knee. The sound that moved through the chamber was something between a gasp and a silence, a collective intake of breath that did not fully release. The king gently took Rennes's hands. His voice was steady, but not loud. It was the voice of a man who does not need volume. "My kingdom still stands because of you." He rose and turned to face the assembly. 40 years ago, he said, my parents were traveling through the countryside in poor weather. The road failed. The carriage overturned. There were men waiting who believed no one would survive. He looked at Rennes. One woman found us. She hid the king, the queen, and their child in her cottage for 3 days. She gave them her last provisions. She refused every reward offered to her. Then she walked back to her life and told no one. Edmund stepped forward. I was the child. The silence in the room was total. Rennes smiled. It was the smile of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and is pleased that it has finally been set down in the right place. King Henry turned to face Duke Aldrich. The Duke looked up for the first time. When your daughter chose to save a life, the king said, what law did she break? He let the question settle. Not one of mine, not one of God's, not one that any man in this room could name without first inventing it. He looked at the assembled nobles. She was punished for an act of mercy by the people who were supposed to protect her. What does that tell us about what we have built here? No one answered, because there was no answer that would not cost the speaker something. Aldrich stepped forward. The movement was difficult to watch, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic. He was a large, certain man, and the certainty had gone out of him, and what was left was simply a father in an expensive coat who had been wrong and knew it. He stopped in front of Alara. She looked at him. He knelt. Not gracefully. He was not a young man, and his knees made their objection known. He knelt anyway. I protected a name, he said. His voice was unsteady in a way she had never heard it. And I lost my daughter. I spent 6 months convincing myself I had acted correctly. I was wrong. I was wrong in the ballroom. And I was wrong when you came to your uncle's house, and I was wrong every morning I woke up and found a reason not to come to Millhaven. He paused. His eyes were red. If you cannot forgive me, I understand that too. I only want you to know that I know. Alara felt the burn of tears behind her eyes. She held them there. She was not ready. That was the true and honest answer. She was not ready in the way that a wound is not ready when it is still in the process of knitting itself back together. She knew forgiveness was coming. She could feel its direction, but she also knew she owed it to herself not to offer it before it was real. She said nothing. She looked at her father for a long moment. Then she very slightly nodded. It was not enough, and it was not nothing. He understood it for what it was. The king turned to Cassian. The proceedings were brief and formal and entirely public. Cassian's royal appointments were revoked. His family's honorary positions were stripped. Future invitations to royal ceremonies would not be extended. His estates, the king noted, remained his own. Wealth, King Henry said, is between a man and his bankers. honor, is between a man and everyone else. Cassian said nothing. He lowered his head and kept it there. And then Edmund crossed the room. He walked to where Ilara was standing, and the court watched him. And he stopped in front of her, and the expression on his face was the same one she had first seen under the oak tree in Millhaven when he was trying to help a 6-year-old sound out a difficult word and was working very hard not to give her the answer before she found it herself. He opened a small velvet box. The ring inside was not large. It was not covered in stones of impressive dimensions. It was a single clear sapphire, deep blue, on a plain gold band, and it was exactly the kind of ring a person chooses when they are not trying to impress anyone except the person they are giving it to. "I didn't fall in love with the Duke's daughter," he said. "I fell in love with the woman who got out of the carriage." He paused. "You've been showing me what a kingdom should look like for a year. I'd like to spend the rest of my life returning the favor." Ilara looked at the ring. She thought about the evening she had sat on a stone wall in the dark with a purse in her lap and the stars overhead, and no one who had thought to ask if she had eaten. She thought about the first morning she had failed to light the stove and laughed about it with an old woman she had only just met. She thought about the children under the oak tree and the soup baskets and the evening tea and the goose and the harvest festival and the things Wren had said in the near dark about bread and faith and the story a man tells himself about who he is. She thought about all of it. "Yes," she said. The applause that broke across the court chamber was the kind that comes from people who are relieved to feel something uncomplicated. The next months were ordinary, which was not the same as uneventful. Wren grew weaker as autumn moved toward winter. She did not complain about this and did not ask for anything beyond what she had always had, which was tea in the evening and company and the satisfaction of a garden that was producing more than it was asked to. Duke Aldrich came to the cottage in November, alone, without announcement. He stood at the gate for a while before Ilara opened it. They did not talk about the ballroom. They did not talk about the uncle's house or the stone wall in the dark. They sat in the 2 wooden chairs under the oak tree while the last of the autumn leaves came down around them, and after a while her father said, "Tell me about the children." And she did, and that was enough. One evening in early winter, Wren called them all to her. She lay in the loft, in the narrow bed under the low ceiling, and she looked at Ilara and Edmund and Marian and Aldrich with eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have seen a very great deal, and are now at rest with all of it. "A kingdom," she said, "is not measured by its castles." She paused. "It is measured by how it treats the person everyone else walks past." She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. Her funeral brought the entire village, which was expected, and half the court nobility, which was not. Duke Aldrich stood near the back and refused the seat prepared for him. Instead, he served. He carried bread and soup to the guests who came to honor her, moving through the crowd without title or announcement, and Ilara watched him do this for a long time before she went to him. He looked up. His face was the face of a man who has been in the process of becoming something for several months, and is not yet certain what it will be. "Father," she said. He covered his face. She let him cry. It seemed like the right thing. After a while, she put her hand on his arm, and he took a breath, and the wind came through the valley the way it does in Millhaven in the early winter, cold and clean, and carrying the smell of frost on the hills. Spring arrived with the kind of insistence that makes its own argument. The wedding was held in Millhaven, in the square by the stream, beneath the oak tree where Ilara had taught 11 children to read. The villagers sat in the front rows. The nobles sat behind them. Duke Aldrich walked his daughter down the aisle of the open square with the careful attention of a man who understands he has been given something back that he did not deserve to have returned to him. Edmund stood at the end of the path in his traveling clothes, which had caused some discussion at the palace and which he had declined to change. When Elara reached him, he smiled, the same smile as always. The bells from the village church began to ring, and at that moment Wren's white goose, who had apparently been given no instructions about the formal nature of the occasion, appeared from behind the refreshment table, seized a bread roll from the royal chef's platter, and chased the chef across the square with an energy that suggested she had been conserving it for exactly this purpose. The laughter that followed was the kind that starts in the chest and moves outward, and even the king, sitting in the third row between a duchess and a nervous lord, could not prevent himself from joining it. Later, when the celebrations had quieted and the lanterns burned low over the square, Elara stood by the stream with Edmund beside her. The water moved over the stones in the way it had always moved, unhurried, indifferent to the particular ceremonies of humans, belonging entirely to itself. She thought about the morning, more than a year ago now, when she had stepped down from a carriage on this road and knelt beside an old woman in the dust. She had not done it because she knew what would follow. She had not done it because she was wise or far-seeing, or because she had calculated the consequences and decided the return was worth the investment. She had done it because a woman was suffering, and she was there, and she could. That was all. And it had led to everything. She did not think this was magic or destiny or the particular reward that the universe distributes to good people. She thought it was something simpler and harder to name, the way a single action, made from the truest part of a person, reaches further than that person can see, touching things and people and futures that have no way of being anticipated from the moment of the action itself. The world does not always reward kindness. She knew that now. She had sat on a stone wall in the dark and learned that particular lesson thoroughly. But kindness reshapes the person who practices it, and the reshaped person reshapes the things around her. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that reshaping travels further than anyone intended. She leaned slightly against Edmund's shoulder. He looked at her. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready," she said. "I just needed to know what I was ready for." The stream moved over its stones. The lanterns burned. Some choices don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience, as lateness, as a ruined dress on a cold road. What we find, when we choose mercy over schedule, is not a reward. It is a truer version of ourselves, the one that was there all along, waiting for the moment we stopped being afraid of what it might cost. That is the only inheritance worth passing down. Not a name, not a title. The willingness to stop.